and has the biggest theory on it. And he talks about moral as an elaboration and refinement of Piaget. He actually took moral dilemmas, which actually is one of your activities that you have to do, one of your discussion board activities. I give you some of Kohlberg's moral dilemmas, and you have to actually respond on them. But he proposed that people pass through a series of 6 stages of moral reasonings, but there's 3 levels. You have your pre-conventional, your conventional, and your post-conventional. And when he looks at a pre-conventional level, rules are set down by others. You have the punishment and obedient orientation, that physical consequences or action determine goodness or badness. If you didn't get paddled, or if you didn't get a spanking, or if you didn't get in trouble, then it wasn't wrong. And so it's that whole idea of being obedient that went with it. So if you didn't have time out, then it wasn't a bad thing. But if you got time out, then more than likely it was a bad thing. Stage 2 is that instrumental relativist orientation, which is right as whatever satisfies one's own needs and occasionally the needs of others. This is kind of like, what am I going to get out of it? And this is why some people talk about this, that it kind of fluctuates, because you probably know someone at your age now that it's like, well, what's in it for me? If you're in that what's in it for me, you're at the lowest level of moral reasoning, because it's kind of like what satisfies your own needs. And occasionally, if it's somebody else happens to be with you, then that's it. And then fairness and reciprocity are present, but they're mostly interpreted as you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So if you're at level 1, stage 2 of Kohlberg's reasonings, if you tend to think that way, which is like the lowest level of moral reasoning. And the second level, which is the conventional level of moral reasoning, individuals adapt the rules and will sometimes kind of like bend the rules to the needs of your group. And it's expectations of family or group or nation as a value in its own right. And it's regardless of immediate or obvious consequences. So you kind of like, you just kind of go with the flow. And that would be like, if you belong to a religious organization or something like that, like we'll just, I'm not going to argue whether or not this is, but let's say you say pro-choice. You know, I believe in pro-choice and pro-choice is it. Then and it's adoption of maybe the religious group that you belong to or your family. But then, and if somebody, let's say somebody was raped or something like that, or they were going to die if they didn't abort the baby, it wouldn't matter to that person. They would say, no, this is wrong, and it's morally wrong, and this is the expectation of my family. I can't do this. Probably mercy killings, moral killings too, in some of the Middle Eastern cultures, where they would say that the girl has shamed their family and stuff because she wore a short skirt or something like that. That would be that level of moral reasoning, because it's an expectation of the family or of your group or of the nation, and it's a value in its own right, and it doesn't matter about the consequences. It's wrong, and therefore it's wrong. And that would be the conventional level. And under the conventional level is stage 3, which is the good girl, good boy orientation, or the good boy, good girl. Good behavior is whatever pleases or helps other people and is approved of by them. So it's the idea that you only do it because your mom and dad will be happy. Or that you're being a good girl or a good boy. A lot of children in a younger age, probably elementary school age, just a lot of times it's a teacher-pleasing behavior. They do it because they want to be thought of as a good boy or a good girl. Stage 4 is a law and order orientation. It is what is right is doing one's duty, showing respect for authority, and maintaining the given social order for its own sake. So this is, you follow the rules. You wouldn't do something because it's against the law, even if it's a stupid law. So if it was against the law, you would just follow the law. And one of the dilemmas that you're going to look at, I believe, I don't remember if it's one of the ones I chose or not, but you look at, and it says, like, you know, somebody's husband is dying, would you steal the medication? And some people will say, no, I wouldn't, because that's against the law. And so we have to say to yourself, but would you do it if it meant, you know, feeding your children? prostitution is against the law. If it was the only way that you had to feed your children, would you do it, or would you say no? If you were at stage 4 of moral development, you would say no because it's against the law. And those are stage 3 and stage 4 are, stage 3 and stage 4 are level 2 of Kohlberg's moral reasoning. Level 3 of Kohlberg's moral reasoning, which is considered to be the higher level, and people define their own values in terms of ethical principles that they choose to follow. So it's not something that's dictated by society. It may not be dictated by your religious beliefs or your church. It's kind of like you develop your own moral compass. So in stage 5, it's the social contract orientation. What is right is defined in terms of general individual rights and in terms of standards that have been agreed upon by the whole society. So it's kind of like looking at society, and you're saying, what is right for society? And that's how laws are actually changed. Because in stage 4, you would just go along with status quo, and you would say, this is my moral compass, it's wrong, so therefore it's not right, and I can't go along with that. In stage 5, you're kind of saying, well, you know what? Laws are not absolute. They're not frozen. They can be changed for the good of society. So if the laws of society are not being good, let's just take something like women's right to vote, or the plight of, being African Americans being slaves. Okay, there were laws that said that women couldn't vote and African Americans could be owned. That we got to the point with a moral compass where we said, there was some social contract orientation that said, you know what, this isn't right. This isn't good for society as a whole. And so then laws were rewritten and laws were changed. Stage 6 in level 3 is the universal ethical principle orientation. And what is right is by your own conscience. And it's according to your self-chosen ethical principles. And these principles are abstract and ethical. It's kind of like this golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They're not specific moral prescriptions such as the 10 Commandments, but they're more like, I would do this because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do it. So some would say Mother Teresa would be somebody who lived to the stage 6, which very few people get to, where she would said, she even wrote things against the Catholic Church, which she was a nun, and in the church, and she'd say I can't do this because it forsakes my God. I can't live with my conscience and being able to do this. So that's at that level 6 is where you can't do it because you couldn't live with yourself because of it, because you have your own abstract and ethical moral compass. So Kohlberg kind of developed these based out of his talkings. He did all these dilemmas with children and adults of all ages. Some of the criticisms of his research, though, was later research that generally supports his main sequence of development, but most of his early work was only done with men, so there was some research that suggested that girls have a different pattern than guys do, and they don't necessarily follow the same order that men do. Another criticism about both Piaget and Kohlberg is that children can often reason about moral situation more sophisticatedly than would the stage would suggest. You have little kids who are able to, maybe go to stage 4 when they're starting to talk about the laws and the rules, and then you have some adults who might fall down to level 2 where they say, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Probably the most important limitation of Kohlberg's theory is that it deals with moral reasoning rather than actual behavior, because somebody might say they would, be altruistic and do something for the good of society, but when they're put to the test, they actually stoop down to level 2. This video, if you're looking at it in a video, it actually, this graphic shows you how Kohlberg's stages of moral development lines up with Piaget's stages of cognitive development and then Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. The next section we're going to look at is how do children develop socially and emotionally. So we have to look at kids in their stages. And then we also have to look at young people and their social emotional development. And obviously a kindergartner is much different than a 16-year-old. And we have to look at, it depends on their experiences that they have between their families, their schools, but most of them follow a pretty predictable panel. Young kids' social life evolves relatively in predictable ways. When we look at kids in preschool years, their peers, other children who are their equal age, they begin to play an increasing importance in their lives. If you talk to like a little 3- and 4-year-old, they'll tell you who their friends are. They start to get this pro-social behavior of volunteering towards caring and sharing and comforting and cooperating with other kids. Most of little kids' interactions are during play. Real young children will do solitary play. They really don't interact with another child. As they start to get a little bit older, they will do parallel play where they might be doing the same activity, but they're really not interacting with one another. They may be playing with Legos, but each one's building their own tower or whatever. And then they get to associative play, which is like parallel play, but then they start to share and they start doing turn taking and they have kind of an interest in what each other are doing. They might say, wow, that's a really good tower. Or they might say, you build this part and I'll build the other part. And that's them leading to cooperative play, which is when they kind of join a common goal and they start to build a large castle, or they each build a part of it. And they're really starting to move towards cooperative play. Games are part of cooperative play as well, and that's why it's kind of difficult to do. Like if you've ever been to a 4- or 5-year-old t-ball game, you know, the little boys out there picking weeds, and you know they're really not playing as a team yet. They're doing more associative play. They're all out on the field together. They're all doing the same kinds of things, but they're not really playing with one another. It's not really till they get to cooperative play when they start to have a common goal. So when we look at early elementary years or elementary years, by the time they enter elementary school, they've developed this more complex thought, action, and social influence. They start talking about, you know, who their best friends are. They start to have like a hierarchy of social structure. They start trying to prove that they're all grown up and being able to do things on their own. And that means that work becomes possible. They're able to start to do things because they're at that initiative stage where they're able to start to do things. They also start to get independent in their action, and then they can cooperate in groups. So if you start them out at a young age and really teach some of those grouping skills, it makes it much easier. And they also start to get this idea of what is fair and fair play. And at this age, in their moral development at least, fairness means that you do treat everybody the same way. And it's not until later in their moral development that they really realize that fairness means that everybody gets what they need, not necessarily that everybody gets the same thing. And there's actually adults that haven't figured that one out yet. All of this idea of social play and being able to interact with other people actually has to do with your self-concept and your self-esteem. So personal and social development in the elementary school, remember that goes back to Erik Erikson's about initiative versus inferiority. There are important ideas of self-concept and self-esteem. Self-concept includes the ways in which we perceive our strengths, weaknesses, abilities, and attitudes and values. So it's our perception, your self-concept. It starts at birth and it continues to be developed by our experience. So the more successes that we have, the more strengths that we perceive ourselves having, and then our weaknesses and overcoming those weaknesses, the stronger our self-concept gets. Our self-esteem, however, refers to how we evaluate our skills and abilities as compared to our peers. So your self-concept is how you rate your own self, how we perceive ourselves and our strengths and our weaknesses, what we're good at, what our attitudes are, what we value. And then our self-esteem refers to how we evaluate our skills and abilities compared to other people. So you can have a okay self-concept and have a good self-esteem because you're like, well, I'm okay with that, but actually I'm a lot better than so-and-so and so-and-so. Or you can have a poor self-concept where you think you're really bad at stuff and you have a lot of weaknesses, and then you look at your self-esteem and you compare yourself to others and you don't stack up. So that's why peers become really important to us, because they're our measuring stick. The influence of a child's family, the major force during their early childhood years, really has to do with your parents and your parents' attitudes and behaviors. If your parents think that you really build you up and let you fail, though. Don't get me wrong. It's not only telling you that you're wonderful and you're good, because you learn just as much from failure as you do from success. I actually think we went overboard a little bit about this with our self-concept, and everybody had to get a medal and everybody had to do well. And then when you get kind of like to your age now, if you're one of those kids that, like you always got the medal and you always did the best, then you really haven't experienced failure yet, and it can really be a huge shock for you when you get older. You're always at the top of your class, and all of a sudden you realize that, you know what, everybody's at the top of the class when you get off to college. So your parents modeling that failure's okay, and that trying hard is more important than winning. And perseverance is a good thing. All of those things are something that helps build that self-esteem and self-concept. So in addition to relationship with brothers and your sisters or your peers, routines from home can be reinforced and must be overcome in school. They're either reinforced or they must be overcome in school. So if you've got parents who constantly put you down or tell you that you're not worth anything, then you come to school, and then teachers have to overcome that. And I can tell you, because I work with EBD kids, emotionally and behaviorally disordered kids, I had a lot of kids that came in and their parents just treated them horribly and told them horrible things about themselves. And so them coming to school, they had this horrible feeling about themselves, and they didn't have good self-concept at all. And so they really struggled with trying to put themselves out there. And then they compare themselves to their peer group, and then that adds a little bit of importance to it as well. So if you don't struggle within your peer group as well, then it struggles as well. So in lower elementary grades, peer groups usually consist of same-sex children who are around about the same age as them. So they start to hang out with, all of your kids in your class, and you might hang out with the boys, hang with the boys, and the girls hang with the girls. But however, in about 6th grade, then you start to commingle with boys and girls. And then there's that little pecking order, too, that goes with who likes who doesn't like who. But you don't necessarily have the gender-specific grouping. During middle school, children's conceptions of friendship also mature. Friendship is that social central relationship. In middle school, more than probably any other grade, that kids go to school to socialize. And they kind of go through this whole series of it because their friends sometimes can be seen as social status. Who you hang out as part of your social status. So sometimes kids will peer up, especially in middle school, with kids that are not necessarily like them in their personality or their belief systems, but they raise them in social status, so they'll kind of put up with some behaviors. They're more companions. But then friends also can be emotional resources. They're the ones that they kind of turn to pick them up or make them feel better. They can be cognitive resources where they're helping them out with school and stuff like that. It goes back to that whole idea of social norms, where who are you hanging out with, what's going on with that. And, like, what is that pecking order? What am I supposed to be doing at this age and at this time? And then we also have to, they also can be that idea of conflict resolution. Kids will be the peacemakers. There will be kids that are the ones that stir things up in the pot. So you have to look at what is the role of different children at different levels. Probably one of the most important things at this age, too, is peer acceptance and the status within the peer group. So you have to look at, like, who's the popular child. The popular child is the kid who's named most by their peers as a person they like, and least often is someone who is disliked. So if you look through, they'll list who the popular kids are, and they're usually the kids that everybody pretty much likes and most people don't dislike. The rejected child is most often by peers as a person who is disliked, and least often that is liked. So this kid is not necessarily not popular, but they're just rejected. Like the whole group of kids either they don't mention them at all or they don't like them. The controversial child is someone who is named who is liked, but also frequently who is named as disliked. And this can happen a lot of time with a child who might be hanging with the popular group and seen as popular, but also can either be like gets in fights a lot, or is a pot stirrer who gets other kids in trouble or talks badly about other children. So they're just as equally named as disliked. And they're a controversial child, so they will usually float in and out of a group. And then there's the average child whose name is being liked and disliked with moderate frequency, and they just kind of have their own little club or small group of kids that they get along with, and they really don't seek that highest level of being the popular child. James Marcia's 4 identity statuses, he identified in-depth interviews with adolescents. This is kids with a little bit higher level than the middle school, that reflect the degree of which adolescents made firm commitments to religious or political values as well as to future occupations. And he really kind of looked at this as 4 different areas. And he talked about foreclosures, which individuals have prematurely established an identity on the basis of their parents' choice rather than their own. So if you're in foreclosure, I've known, and this can be cultural. I knew of a young gentleman who was of Indian descent, and his dad wanted him to be a doctor, and that's what he was going to be, even though he didn't want to be a doctor. But even though he was like 21 years old, he was still in foreclosure because he went on to medical school because that's what his family expected him to do. Identity diffusion is individuals have found neither an occupational direction or an ideological commitment. So they're really not like what their parents want to be, and then they really don't know what they want to be. So they're kind of like in limbo. They have this identity diffusion. And when they talk about identity diffusion, I think like failure to launch would be one that they kind of like are just kind of stuck there. Well, actually that goes to moratorium, which is individuals have begun to experiment with occupational and ideological choices, but they haven't made the jump yet. So when you have identity diffusion, you just haven't made a choice yet. Usually they tend to lean a little bit close to their parents' choice, but they say, I don't know about that, and they haven't really made that commitment yet. And then we have identity achievement, and this is the state of identity consolidation, in which in which adolescents have made their own clear-cut decisions about what they believe, their ideology, and also about their occupation. If you look at the 4 stages in like this matrix form, diffusion has low level of identity or commitment and low level of search, which is the crisis. So they really are not really they have a low level, they don't really know what they want to be, and they really aren't looking to be anything. And the moratorium is they have a low level of identity. They haven't made a commitment yet, but they have a high level of search. So they're kind of in crisis. They're in moratorium. They're like, oh my God, what am I going to be? I don't know what I want to be. And they have this low level of, a high level of crisis. When you're in foreclosure, you have high level of identity. So they kind of like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then they have a low level of search. A low level of search, which means that they don't really see that they have a crisis. They just know what they want to do, but they can't figure out how to do it. And then if you have achievement, you have high level of identity, which is commitment, and then high level of search, which is crisis. So you know what you want to do, you know where you want to go, and you're putting your efforts towards that. If you want to enhance your social emotional development, there are many programs to do that. School-based social emotional learning SEL programs can make significant differences in kids' outcomes, and in some cases can improve academic achievement as well. There's a lot of programs out there that focus on building self-esteem and building self-confidence and working through the different social emotional issues of adolescence and primary grades. Anti-bullying programs are big ones on this. These programs include school day and after-school programs, preventative programs for all students as well as those experiencing difficulties. A focus on social emotional learning can have a long-lasting impact on kids, because this is getting along with other people. This isn't just about getting through school. Self-concept and self-esteem also change as children enter and go through adolescence. They shift from more abstract portrayals continues, and then the adolescent self-descriptions often include personal traits about being friendly or obnoxious. You know, I'm likable, I'm not likable. Their emotions will fluctuate a lot too. They go through depression, their psyche, or they get psyched about stuff. They get really excited about things that go through, and they'll kind of like ebb and flow. And then they go through personal beliefs depending on where their parents were in the beginning, whether they're liberal or conservative. A lot of kids will, during this time, will swap between that because they're trying to pull away from their parents and become their own person. So if they have real conservative parents, they might become liberal. If they're real liberal, they might become conservative. And they kind of go through that little ebb and flow that goes along with it. And as they go through these stages, their self-concept becomes more differentiated, that they can differentiate themselves from their parents. And that's probably the most important thing that happens. Your self-esteem goes through fluctuations and changes during adolescence. Self-esteem is lowest as children enter middle school or junior high, especially with the onset of puberty, because with all those hormones raging through your body, they just question everything. Early maturing girls tend to suffer the most dramatic and long-lasting decreases in self-esteem. We don't know why, but if you mature really early as a girl, I think that there's just too much pressure put on you as society, and you're kind of outcasted by other girls too, that they tend to have a lower self-esteem. Global self-esteem and feelings of self-worth appear to be influenced most strongly by physical appearance and then by societal acceptance from your peers. So the more attractive you are, the more attractive you are to your peers. That whole idea of global self-esteem and feelings of self-worth tend to be higher. And then you become more socially acceptable by your peers. And so unfortunately, a lot of children, we have to teach them to not judge a book by its cover, but look at the person underneath. And that usually doesn't happen until they're older and they grow into their own self. As children, social relationships and peers, as children enter adolescence, changing the nature of their friends also takes place. In general, the amount of time spent with friends, their peers increases dramatically. They'll move much more away from their parents and much more towards peers. Adolescents spend more time with their peers than they do with their family or by themselves. Adolescents who have satisfying and harmonious friendships also report high levels of self-esteem and less loneliness, and have more mature social skills and do better in schools. So kids kind of start to pull away and do that kind of stuff. When we talk about peer relationships, in addition to their close friends, most adolescents also play a high value on the large peer group. And that's one of the reasons why in high schools and stuff you get cliques and stuff, because they have an identifying crowd that goes along with them. And it goes to their idea of what their values are and the companionship and entertainment. So depending on what you do, what music you listen to, what kinds of classes that you take, what kind of sports that you play, those are your identities that kind of help shape what your entertainment and your companionship is. The nature of peer relationships in adolescence has been categorized by the term of social status and peer crowds. The kids who are popular and well accepted tend to display positive conflict resolution and academic skills, pro-social behavior, and leadership abilities. Kids who are rejected or poorly accepted tend to display aggressive and antisocial behavior and low academic performance, which is one of the reasons why a lot of schools are trying this different kinds of conflict resolution conflict resolution programs. And they go into this whole idea of building up self-esteem, having group chats and talks so that everyone can see how one another's perceptions and words affect everyone in the group. When we talk about emotional development, most adolescents experience emotional conflicts at some point. We call it teenage angst. For most adolescents, that distress is temporary, and if it's successfully handled, then kids do fine. But if it's unsuccessfully handled, it can lead to delinquency, drug abuse, and suicide attempts, because suicide is one of the major causes of death in adolescence. Emotional health is also a key factor in academic success in school. When children are depressed, they tend to not do as well in school. Other emotions for this age group include anger, guilt, frustration, and jealousy. You know, there's just, like I said, emotions are running high at this time. Which brings us to some of the problems during adolescence. And this is probably the greatest risk factor because you are just starting to get into that abstract thinking. They're just getting really into that whole idea of formal operations. So thinking about long-term and doing hypotheticals of long-term is a relatively new ability. So they don't necessarily foresee the problems with certain behaviors or what they're doing. I always think about that with like my 12-year-old daughter wanted to buy this, I call it a hoochie mama dress. And I was trying to say that she looked fabulous in it, don't get me wrong, but at 12 years old, she wasn't ready for the message that she was sending out that went along with it because they don't foresee what could possibly happen. So potential problems also include like having an emotional disorder or being identified as having an emotional disorder. Bullying is really hard at this time too. Dropping out of school, kids don't necessarily see because the school is not necessarily a friendly place, so they would rather not be there. A lot of kids, this is when drug and alcohol abuse comes in. The idea of delinquency, you know, getting in with the wrong peer group and becoming a delinquent. There's definitely a really high risk of pregnancy that goes along with that, risk of sexually transmitted disease, just a risk of being sexual promiscuity, and confusing your sexual identity for, you know, thinking that having sex with someone makes you popular or brings you part of the group. So that's the end of chapter 3 and social, moral, and emotional development.